The email came in at 8:17 a.m. sandwiched between quarterly projections and a vendor dispute. Candidate for senior operations role, strong background. The subject line read. I almost forwarded it straight to my director of talent acquisition. I rarely review initial resumes anymore. That was the point of building a structure large enough to delegate. But something made me open it. Maybe the timing. Maybe the instinct that certain mornings arrive carrying more than numbers. I clicked. The resume loaded slowly and I skimmed past the bullet points at first. Regional management experience, operational oversight, cost reduction initiatives. The language was polished, carefully curated. Then I saw the name. Daniel Mercer. My ex-husband. For a moment the office around me felt unusually still. The muted hum of the city beyond the glass walls faded into background noise. He had applied. To my company. I scrolled back to the top of the email and read the header more carefully. It had been forwarded by HR with a note. Strong candidate. Competitive background. Competitive. I leaned back in my chair and closed the resume. What he didn't know was whose name was on the letterhead. Daniel didn't shout when he dismantled my confidence. He did it quietly. He preferred sentences that sounded like concern but carried precision. You're too idealistic, he would say when I spoke about launching my own consulting practice. The world doesn't reward vision without backing. Backing. What he meant was his. When I suggested restructuring my career path to focus on operations strategy, he laughed softly, not cruelly, just dismissively. That's not how it works, he'd tell me. You need connections. You need leverage. You don't have that. During our third year of marriage, when I stayed up late drafting a proposal for an independent contract, he stood in the doorway watching me. You're exhausting yourself, he said. You're not built for this kind of pressure. Not built for it. The phrase settled into me slowly like sediment. He was always careful to frame it as realism. I'm protecting you from disappointment, he insisted. You'll never succeed without me. It became a refrain. When I negotiated small contracts, he minimized them. When I closed one, he attributed it to timing. When I spoke about scaling, he tilted his head in that patient way that made me feel younger than I was. You need my network, he said once, as if explaining something obvious. You need my credibility. The irony now feels almost architectural. Back then it felt like gravity. I began second-guessing my instincts, shrinking ideas before presenting them, asking for his approval in conversations that didn't require it. You'll never succeed without me. He didn't say it angrily. He said it confidently. And confidence, when repeated often enough, can begin to sound like truth. Until it isn't. The sentence had lived in our marriage for years, but it wasn't until the divorce that he said it without disguise. We were standing in the hallway of the house we were about to sell. Boxes lined the walls. The air felt temporary. Lawyers had been emailing back and forth for weeks, but this was the first time the conflict felt unfiltered. You're making a mistake, he said, pacing slowly. You think you can build something on your own? I don't think, I replied. I know. He stopped walking. You know. He almost laughed. You wouldn't have gotten half your early contracts without my introductions. Introductions. I had heard that word before. I did the work, I said quietly. You did the execution, he corrected. Execution isn't the same as leverage. That was when it shifted from disagreement to dismissal. If we're being honest, he continued, voice tightening, you'd be nothing without my connections. Nothing. The word echoed in the empty hallway. And he didn't lower his voice this time. The real estate agent was in the kitchen pretending not to hear. Our neighbor stood in the driveway waiting to collect a borrowed ladder. The humiliation wasn't theatrical, but it was exposed. You'll never succeed without me, he said again, not as advice but as a verdict. For a moment I considered arguing. Instead I nodded. Not because I agreed. Because I recognized something. The line had been crossed. Belittlement inside a marriage can be rationalized as tension. Spoken out loud in the open, it becomes clarity. That was the day I stopped asking for permission to believe in myself. The months after the divorce were quieter than I expected. There were no dramatic announcements. No triumphant posts about fresh starts. I didn't move to a different city or change my last name in a symbolic gesture of reinvention. I simply went back to work. Not visibly. Strategically. I downsized my apartment and redirected the difference into building infrastructure. I registered my consulting firm, properly refined my pitch decks, and reached out to the few clients I had once handled independently. I worked long nights at my kitchen table, laptop open beside cold coffee, adjusting pricing models and restructuring proposals. I didn't post about it. I didn't need validation from an audience that had once watched my marriage dissolve in polite silence. When I secured my first major contract after the divorce, I signed the paperwork alone. No celebratory dinner. No public announcement. Just a quiet transfer confirmation and a revised projection sheet. Each project led to another. Small operational audits turned into longer engagements. I focused on measurable outcomes instead of narrative wins. I built relationships slowly without attaching my credibility to anyone else's name. There were nights I questioned whether he had been right, whether the absence of his network would limit my reach. But every time doubt surfaced, I returned to data. Revenue, retention, referrals, results. I didn't need to be loud. I needed to be consistent. Silence can look like stagnation from the outside. From the inside, it can be recalibrated. And while he assumed I had stepped backward, I was building something he wouldn't recognize until it was too late to dismiss. I didn't set out to build something impressive. I set out to build something durable. The first year was lean. I handled operational audits for mid-sized firms that were too large for boutique consultants, but too small for global agencies. I worked directly with CFOs who cared less about brand names and more about inefficiencies. I didn't sell ambition. I sold corrections. By the second year, referrals replaced cold outreach. One restructuring led to a merger advisory role. One integration project turned into 3. My client base shifted upward quietly. Then the contracts grew larger. I hired my first analyst, then a compliance lead. I moved from my apartment dining table to a small office space with glass partitions and neutral furniture that didn't pretend to be more than it was. I didn't chase headlines. I built systems. Then versus. Now. Then I asked Daniel to introduce me to potential contacts. Now firms approached me directly. Then he questioned whether I could handle pressure. Now I evaluated whether entire departments could. Then my ambition was described as unrealistic. Now it was requested. The pivot wasn't explosive. It was incremental. The firm expanded because it solved problems cleanly. We were known for precision, for documentation, for not cutting corners. I didn't need a title to validate it, but I accepted one when it came. Founder and managing director. It sat quietly on my business card, understated but firm. By the time Daniel's resume appeared in my inbox, my company wasn't fragile. It was stable. The irony wasn't dramatic. It was structural. He once believed I needed his leverage to survive. Now I have built my own. And I didn't advertise it. I just maintained it. I reopened the attachment and read it slowly this time. Daniel had always been good at presentation. His resume reflected that. Clean formatting. Confident language. Led cross-functional teams. Drove operational efficiency. Expanded market reach by 18%. I recognized some of the achievements. I also recognized the omissions. There was no mention of the stalled acquisition he had once championed. No reference to the restructuring that followed. No explanation for the 18-month gap between roles. Instead, he described that period as independent strategic advisory. Independent. The phrasing was almost familiar. I scanned the bullet points more carefully. Several projects were described in language that blurred ownership. Initiatives that had been collaborative were framed as singular leadership. Failures were repositioned as transitional phases. There was ambition in the document. And something else. Urgency. The tone wasn't desperate, but it was reaching. His accomplishments were arranged in a way that suggested he needed the reader to believe in upward trajectory. He didn't know who the reader was. I checked the cover letter next. He wrote about aligning with organizations that value resilience and forward thinking. He emphasized adaptability, growth under pressure. Under pressure. I remembered the hallway in our old house the day he said I would be nothing without his connections. Now his resume was asking for access to mine. The irony wasn't theatrical. It was precise. He was applying for a senior operations role, reporting ultimately to me. He believed he was submitting credentials to a hiring committee. He didn't realize he was placing his professional narrative in the hands of the woman he once dismissed. I closed the document and stared at the city skyline outside my office window. Leverage doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, sometimes in your inbox. I didn't rely solely on the resume. That would have been careless. I reached out to a former colleague of his, someone I trusted, to speak candidly under the guise of professional due diligence. I kept the tone neutral, procedural. "We're reviewing candidates," I said. I wanted context. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Daniel?" the colleague asked carefully. "Yes." Another pause, longer this time. "He's capable," the colleague began. But there were tensions. Tensions? Operational disagreements? I prompted. Strategic overreach, he clarified. He pushed expansions that weren't fully backed by internal structure. Internal structure. The phrase felt familiar. Were there performance concerns? I asked. "More about judgment than skill," he replied. "He's ambitious. Sometimes ahead of the data." Ahead of the data. I thanked him and ended the call without pressing further. It wasn't scandal. Didn't collapse. But it wasn't the seamless upward climb his resume suggested. He hadn't left his last role entirely on his own terms. He had been recalibrated. I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands. The situation wasn't about revenge. It was about fit. For years he had believed I lacked the structure to sustain success. Now his own record revealed strain where structure had been tested. The suspense wasn't whether he was qualified. It was whether he understood the room he was walking into, and whether he would recognize it in time. I didn't schedule the interview myself. I forwarded the resume back to HR with a brief note. "Proceed to second round panel." No commentary. No indication of personal history. Professional distance is easiest to maintain when systems are intact. The initial interview would be conducted by 2 senior directors and our head of compliance. My name would not appear on the calendar invite. It wasn't a deception. It was structured. If he advanced, the final review would require executive approval. Mine. I watched the internal scheduling notification populate on my dashboard. Tuesday, 10 a.m. Conference Room B. There was a small quiet satisfaction in knowing he would prepare meticulously for that meeting. He always did. He would review the company website, study our leadership team, and rehearse answers about operational philosophy and growth scalability. He would not expect me. I didn't alter the process. I didn't manipulate the panel. I allowed merit to speak first. That was important. This wasn't about humiliating him. It was about clarity. I spent the weekend reviewing his file again, not to find weakness but to ensure neutrality. I underlined phrases that felt inflated. I noted areas where verification would matter. By Monday evening, I had placed his resume inside a slim black folder labeled Final Review. I did not anticipate the meeting emotionally. I prepared for it structurally, because confrontation is rarely about volume. It's about timing. And Tuesday at 10 a.m. timing would arrive quietly. Conference Room B is intentionally unremarkable. Glass walls, neutral carpet, long rectangular table. Nothing about it signals hierarchy. That's by design. Interviews should feel structured, not theatrical. I arrived 5 minutes before the scheduled time and took the seat at the far end of the table. Not because I needed distance but because it was my position. The panel had already conducted their portion. The feedback summary sat neatly in front of me. Strong operational insight, one note read. Confident presentation. Another. Some tendency to overstate strategic impact. The door opened at exactly 10:02 a.m. Daniel stepped in, the portfolio in hand, posture composed. He greeted the HR coordinator first, then turned toward the table. He saw me. Recognition didn't register immediately. His expression remained neutral for a fraction of a second, professionally rehearsed. Then it shifted. Not dramatically, but visibly. He masked it quickly. Years of corporate composure don't disappear easily. "Good morning," he said evenly. "Good morning, Daniel," I replied. I gestured toward the chair opposite me. "Please." He sat. There was no tension in my tone. No pointed remark about the irony of the situation. The silence between us wasn't hostile. It was calibrated. "I understand you've met with the initial panel," I began. "Yes," he said, voice steady. It was a productive conversation. I've reviewed their notes, I continued. I'd like to ask a few clarifying questions. He nodded. I asked about his previous role, specifically the expansion initiative that stalled. He answered, carefully framing it as a calculated risk that didn't align with conservative board priorities. I listened without interruption. You described that period as independent advisory, I said, glancing briefly at the resume. Can you clarify the scope? He hesitated just slightly. Consulting support for transitional leadership teams, he replied. Independent? I asked. Yes. I let the silence hold for a moment before moving on. There was no need to reference the hallway argument from years ago. No need to repeat the phrase he once used as prophecy. You'll never succeed without me. That sentence existed in a different room. This one required evaluation. Why this company? I asked. He met my eyes directly now. Because it values structural integrity, he said. And sustainable growth. The irony was almost precise enough to acknowledge. But I didn't. Instead, I closed the folder gently. Thank you for your time, I said. We'll follow up after an internal review. He stood slowly. For a brief second, something unspoken passed between us. Not resentment. Not apology. Recognition. He had once believed I needed his network to survive. Now he had walked into my interview room. And I hadn't raised my voice once. I didn't respond immediately. I reviewed the full evaluation report the following morning, not as his former wife but as managing director. The panel had scored him well in presentation, moderately in technical depth, and lower in risk alignment. Risk alignment mattered most. Our firm had built its reputation on measured execution. His history suggested ambition that occasionally outpaced infrastructure. I drafted the response carefully. After thorough consideration, we have decided to move forward with candidates whose experience aligns more closely with our current operational needs. No reference to personal history. No emotional undertone. Just structure. I forwarded the message to HR for official release. An hour later, I received a direct email from him. I understand, he wrote. Thank you for the opportunity. Nothing more. No accusation. No bitterness. No reference to the past. The professionalism was almost respectful. I closed the email and returned to the quarterly forecast on my screen. Authority doesn't require spectacle. It requires clarity. Years ago, he told me I wouldn't succeed without his leverage. Today, I evaluated his resume without using any of it. And that was the only confirmation I needed. 2 days after the formal rejection, another message arrived. This one wasn't through HR. Came directly to my inbox. Funny how things change, he wrote. I suppose I underestimated you. There was no sarcasm in the sentence. No bitterness. Just a kind of restrained acknowledgement. I read it twice before responding. I focused on building, I replied. That was always the plan. I didn't elaborate. He didn't ask for reconsideration. He didn't attempt to reopen the door. The exchange was brief, almost quiet in its tone. There was no dramatic apology. No theatrical reconciliation. Just a recalibration. For years, his certainty had shaped the narrative of our marriage. My ambition was naive. My plans are unrealistic. My independence conditional. Now the evidence existed without debate. Not because I proved him wrong emotionally. Because I built something measurable. He had applied through the same channels as any other candidate. He had been evaluated against the same standards. He had received the same outcome. No humiliation. No special treatment. Just structure. Closure doesn't always arrive with a speech. Sometimes it arrives in a 2-sentence email that acknowledges reality without asking to rewrite it. And sometimes that's enough. Later that evening, I opened an old archived folder in my email. I don't keep many things from that chapter of my life, but I never deleted one particular message. The subject line was ordinary. The body wasn't. You're going to struggle without my connections, he had written during the divorce. You're not built to win on your own. Not built to win. I stared at the sentence for a moment, not with resentment but with distance. At the time, it had felt like a prophecy. Like gravity. Like a ceiling I would inevitably collide with. Now it reads differently. It reads like a projection. He thought I needed him to win. What he didn't understand was that I never needed permission to build. I closed the email and leaned back in my chair looking out at the skyline beyond my office windows. Success doesn't arrive in a single dramatic moment. It accumulates. It compounds. It strengthens quietly while others assume you've stalled. He measured power in access. I measured it in execution. The difference isn't loud. It's lasting. Growth doesn't require applause. It doesn't require validation from someone who once doubted you. It requires consistency. And consistency doesn't ask for permission. It simply continues. And sometimes that is the most definitive answer of all.